Good afternoon, everyone, and today I'll be reading Chapter 8 of Charlotte's Web. It's another short chapter. Thank you to everyone who's watching and following along with me and tracking the story with me. We left off with Wilbur finding out the bad news that Mr. Zuckerman plans to slaughter him and eat him for Christmas dinner. Because we know that we eat pigs, and when pigs are on a farm, we fatten them up and we make pork and bacon and ham with pigs. So Wilbur just found out the farmer's plan. And who came to his rescue? Charlotte, the spider. And Charlotte is very smart and she traps insects in her web and sucks their blood, but she's still very kind. And she said, "Wilbur, I will save you. Don't worry. I'm not going to let you die." And Wilbur was saying, "I don't want to die, Charlotte." And we felt really bad for Wilbur. And I asked the question, how could a spider save a pig? And one of you posted, "I don't think Charlotte can save Wilbur." And that's great because you made a prediction. And you should always be asking questions, making connections, making predictions when you read. And I'll be doing the same thing when I read. So while you listen to me, make sure you're doing that. That's where we left off. This chapter is called A Talk at Home, and it's a short one, and we're going to find some more out about Fern. And remember, Fern is the 8-year-old girl, and she visits Wilbur. She saved Wilbur's life in the beginning, and she loves the animals on the farm. So let's see what this chapter entails. Chapter 8, A Talk at Home. On Sunday morning, Mr. and Mrs. Arable and Fern were sitting at breakfast in the kitchen. Avery had finished and was upstairs looking for his slingshot. "Did you know that Uncle Homer's goslings had hatched?" asked Fern. "How many?" asked Mr. Arable. "7, replied Fern. "There were 8 eggs, but 1 egg didn't hatch, and the goose told Templeton that she didn't want it anymore, so he took it away." "The goose did what?" asked Mrs. Arable, gazing at her daughter with a queer, worried look. "She told Templeton she didn't want the egg anymore," repeated Fern. "Who is Templeton?" asked Mrs. Arable. "He's the rat," replied Fern. "None of us like him very much." Who's us?" asked Mr. Arable. "Oh, everybody in the barn. Wilbur and the sheep and the lambs and the goose and the gander and the goslings and Charlotte and me." "Charlotte?" said Mrs. Arable. "Who's Charlotte?" "She's Wilbur's best friend. She's terribly clever." "What does she look like?" asked Mrs. Arable. "Well," said Fern thoughtfully, "she has 8 legs. All spiders do, I guess." "Charlotte is a spider?" asked Fern's mother. Fern nodded. "A big gray one. She has a web across the top of Wilbur's doorway. She catches flies and sucks their blood. Wilbur adores her." "Does he really?" said Mrs. Arable rather vaguely. She was staring at Fern with a worried expression on her face. "Oh, yes, Wilbur adores Charlotte," said Fern. "Do you know what Charlotte said when the goslings hatched?" "I haven't the faintest idea," said Mr. Arable. "Why don't you tell us?" "Well, when the first gosling stuck its head out from under the goose, I was sitting on my stool in the corner, and Charlotte was on her web. She made a speech, and she said, 'I am sure that every one of us here in the barn cellar will be gratified to learn that after 4 weeks of unremitting effort and patience on the part of the goose, she now has something to show.' For it. Don't you think that was a pleasant thing for her to say?" "Yes, I do," said Mrs. Arable. "And now, Fern, it's time to get ready for Sunday school. And tell Avery to get ready, and this afternoon you can tell me more about what goes on at Uncle Homer's barn. Aren't you spending a lot of time there? You go there almost every afternoon, don't you?" "I like it there," replied Fern. She wiped her mouth and ran upstairs. After she left the room, Mrs. Arable spoke in a low voice to her husband. "I worry about Fern," she said. "Did you hear her? The way she rambled on about the animals, pretending that they talked?" Mr. Arable chuckled. "Maybe they do talk," he said. "I've sometimes wondered. At any rate, don't worry about Fern. She's just got a lively imagination. Kids think they hear all sorts of things." "Just the same, I do worry about her," replied Mrs. Arable. "I think I shall ask Dr. Dorian about her the next time I see him. He loves Fern almost as much as we do, and I want him to know how queerly she is acting about that pig and everything. I don't think it's normal. You know perfectly well that animals don't talk." Mr. Arable grinned. Maybe our ears aren't as sharp as Fern's, he said. And that is the end of our chapter. So what just happened? Fern's parents are worried about Fern. And one of my questions that I asked earlier on was answered. Because remember I asked, do you think the humans can hear the animals? And I was wondering that. And that question was just answered, that Fern can actually hear the animals talk. But the adults cannot. So Mr. and Mrs. Arable, Fern's parents, are like really scared because her daughter is saying, yeah, I talked to the spider and I talked to the pig and the goose. And they're saying, oh, you talk to them. You hear those voices. So they're worried about their daughter because the adults cannot hear the animals talk. So that was an important little detail there. Fern can hear the animals talking. And I'm wondering if she talks back to them because she hasn't talked back to them really yet. So we learned about that. The parents are worried because it doesn't seem normal. But Mr. Arable said, oh, she just got a good imagination on her. So not much about our animals. That was a really short chapter. There wasn't even any pictures or anything. But we still did learn something. So that is that chapter. Keep on watching. Thank you very much and have a great afternoon.